slides on epidemiology of Barrett's. So Barrett's is basically metaplasia, columnar metaplasia in the esophagus. Normally, esophagus has stratified squamous epithelium. But if this gets replaced by columnar epithelium, then it is called Barrett's. Now, in some places, like in US, it has to be intestinal metaplasia to call it Barrett's, whereas in some, a columnar metaplasia is sufficient to call it Barrett's actually. So here you can see, instead of stratified squamous epithelium, what you're having is a columnar epithelium with these goblet cells. So this is what happens in Barrett's esophagus. In terms of epidemiology, again, the data is mainly from the Western country. We don't have any prevalence data from India. In the general population, the estimated prevalence is around 1%, but it's commoner in patients with GERD. And if somebody has GERD with other risk factors, then the prevalence is even higher. These risk factors I'll be showing in the next slide. It is supposed to be lower. The prevalence of Barrett's is supposed to be lower in Asian countries, but again, data is a bit conflicting. So these are the risk factors for Barrett's esophagus. So obviously, the most important is chronic GERD, which is the most important risk factor. Then you have other risk factors like male sex, smoking, obesity, okay, and other factors like older age, large hiatus hernia, family history of Barrett's esophagus. Now, these are not only risk factors for Barrett's per se, but many of these risk factors actually also are risk factors for progression to a dysplasia or even adenocarcinoma. And that's where it's important to know about these risk factors, because if somebody is smoking, then we'll have to ask him to stop smoking, weight reduction in obese patients, because these patients have a higher risk of progression as well, okay? So these are the risk factors for Barrett's. Again, pathogenesis, I won't discuss the details, but just to tell you briefly that, as I said earlier, that metaplasia is a response of an epithelium to injurious stimuli. And Barrett's, the injurious stimuli is actually acid, which is the most important one. They may also be bile and factors like smoking, microbiome, etc. So what these injurious agents do is that they promote pathways which lead to more columnar cytokeratin and inhibit pathways which lead to sort of there is lesser squamous cytokeratin. So there is a promotion of columnar cytokeratin, and therefore you see columnar metaplasia in Barrett's esophagus. So this is again the intestinal metaplasia. This is how the histology of Barrett's looks. You can see the columnar epithelium with these goblet cells. Now, the clinical importance, again, as I said, for metaplasia lies in the fact that some of these lesions may progress to dysplasia and some of them may progress to adenocarcinoma. And that's what we try to prevent when we manage somebody with Barrett's. So what happens without dysplasia, the nucleus is actually normal size located towards the base. But in dysplasia, the nucleus becomes larger in size, it may lose polarity, and then it can sometimes progress to adenocarcinoma. Now, in terms of clinical features, now there are no specific features for Barrett's per se, but because these patients often have a gastroesophageal reflux disease, they may have reflux symptoms like heartburn, regurgitation. But often when we are doing endoscopy for a dyspepsia, we incidentally pick up a finding suggestive of Barrett's. And occasionally patients may come to us with complications of GERD like stricture, bleeding. So that was briefly about the epidemiology and the risk factor, of which we said chronic GERD is the most important risk factor, and older age, obesity, smoking, male, etc. are the other risk factors. Okay. So next we move on to the diagnosis. Now, if you see an appearance on endoscopy like this, then how do you confirm that it is Barrett's esophagus? So the diagnosis, the current standard of diagnosis of Barrett's is basically endoscopy and biopsy. When you do endoscopy and you find this salmon or pink colored mucosa, which extends for at least more than 1 centimeter above the G junction, then you suspect Barrett's. And then in this segment of mucosa, you take biopsies. And if the biopsy shows columnar metaplasia, that's when you confirm that the patient has Barrett's. Now, please remember, sometimes these patients may have significant esophagitis, which may impair histological assessment. So therefore, in those situations, it may be appropriate to treat the patient with PPI for about 3 months and then reassess for the diagnosis as well as dysplasia. So now this is about endoscopy, and this slide is very important from the postgraduate's perspective, that when you're doing an endoscopy and you suspect somebody to have Barrett's esophagus, what are the landmarks, what are the points you're going to include in your reporting actually? So the important landmarks to report are the GE junction or the gastroesophageal junction, the squamocolumnar junction, and the diaphragmatic pinch, okay? So the G junction is essentially the upper end of gastric fold. So these are the gastric folds. The upper end of fold is where the G junction lies. Okay. The squamocolumnar junction is where the stratified squamous and columnar epithelium meet. Okay. Now from the G junction, if the squamocolumnar junction is more than 1 centimeter at more than 1 centimeter distance, then you suspect Barrett's. Okay. And then you have to report how far this squamocolumnar junction is from the G junction. Now, often they may be tongue submucosa, so it may not be totally it may not be a uniform circumferential lesion. Okay. So therefore, you have to report both the circumferential extent, that is, till what level the entire circumference is involved, and then also the length of the tongue, which has got the maximum extent or the maximal extent. And both the extent should be measured from the G junction. So you report the circumferential extent, you report the maximal extent of squamocolumnar junction. And then you also talk about the diaphragmatic pinch because that decides your whether there's a hiatus hernia, how long is the hiatus hernia. So in patients where the squamocolumnar junction is more than 1 centimeter away from G junction, you have to take biopsy to confirm Barrett's. The biopsy which is recommended according to the Seattle protocol is the 4-quadrant biopsy every 2 centimeter. Okay. So just to summarize, the endoscopy report should talk about the circumferential and the maximal extent according to the prior classification, describe hiatus hernia if present. In esophagitis, again, it has implications on management. Then patients with Barrett's may sometimes have focal lesions, especially those with high-grade dysplasia. These focal lesions should be properly described in terms of their Barrett's type as well as the location, because that has a bearing on the management. So these are the important elements to include in endoscopy reporting. So once you have sent the specimen for biopsy, then you have to again look at the pathology report in detail. First of all, you should see if there is columnar metaplasia, because that is what is required to confirm the diagnosis of Barrett's. Then you should look if there's any dysplasia, adenocarcinoma, because that is going to decide your management. If the patient has significant inflammation on biopsy, then inflammation can hamper the assessment of dysplasia. And therefore, in these patients, again, they may have to get PPI and you may have to reassess after 2 to 3 months. And finally, very important to remember that there is significant inter-observer variation in pathologist reporting, especially for low-grade dysplasia. And therefore, experience of pathologist is something which you have to consider when you are looking at the report. So why is this dysplasia in pathology report important? Now, the risk of progression of Barrett's to a high-grade lesion or a carcinoma really depends on dysplasia. If there is no dysplasia, the risk of progression is quite low. Whereas high-grade dysplasia, the risk of progression is high, and these patients need to have some therapy. No dysplasia group can be kept under surveillance. The low-grade group has intermediate risk. So this group can be either kept on surveillance, or they may now, more recently, there is more evidence favoring ablation even in low-grade dysplasia. Okay, so that's the importance of knowing the dysplasia in your report. The other thing which I said in the previous slide is the inter-observer agreement. So if you look at this slide, the inter-observer agreement for low-grade dysplasia and indeterminate for dysplasia is actually quite poor, 0.1 to 0.3. It's better for no dysplasia and high grade. This is something which you have to keep in mind because so much hinges on your management of lesion based on dysplasia. So therefore, it may be good to get another opinion from an expert pathologist when in doubt. So far we have discussed about the epidemiology of Barrett's and what are the risk factors. How do you diagnose, especially in terms of endoscopy? What are the landmarks we should look at? How we should report taking 4-quadrant biopsies? Okay, then once we have the biopsy, what are the features we should look for in the biopsy report? Okay, experience of pathologist also is important. So once you have diagnosed a Barrett's esophagus, the next step is management of Barrett's esophagus. Okay. Now, management in terms of drugs, the drugs like PPI, their main role is to control the underlying GERD and to heal esophagitis. For Barrett's per se, the role is still not very clear, although there is data to suggest that if somebody is on long-term PPI, there is a reduced risk of progression to cancer. But these are mainly based on observational studies, and the data is not very strong for a uniform recommendation. Similarly, various drugs have been tried as chemopreventive agent to prevent progression to dysplasia or carcinoma, like aspirin, NSAIDs, etc. But here again, the benefit has mainly been in observational studies, and you read more data. But here I just want to briefly mention about this one trial which was published in Lancet in 2018. This is called the ASPECT trial. Okay, so this was basically a randomized trial which had 4 arms. These are patients with Barrett's esophagus who did not have dysplasia. So one group got low dose PPI, one group got high dose PPI, one group had low dose PPI with aspirin, and one group got high dose PPI with aspirin. And the endpoint was combined mortality, high grade dysplasia, or adenocarcinoma. All three together were the endpoint. So in the group which received high dose PPI with aspirin, the endpoints, there were lower number of patients with endpoints compared to the other group. But again, this was an open label trial. There was a significant dropout as well. So based on the current data, there is no uniform recommendation for a chemoprophylaxis or a long-term BPI. So moving on to the management of Barrett's per se. So the management of Barrett's, as I said, depends really on your dysplasia. Most patients will not have any dysplasia. So these patients can be kept on a surveillance endoscopy every 3 to 5 years. Those who are indeterminate for dysplasia, they may be given PPI therapy and reassessed after 3 to 6 months. Now, in patients who have dysplasia, which can be low grade or high grade, there are two things. One is there a focal visible lesion? And then management of the rest of the mucosa. If there is a focal or a visible lesion, like a depressed lesion or nodule, etc., then that has to be removed endoscopically. After you remove the focal lesion, then you have to manage the rest of the lesion. If it is low-grade dysplasia, you have the option of doing either a surveillance, but more recently, meta-analysis has shown that ablation has better outcome than surveillance. So even for low-grade dysplasia, now there is a trend towards offering ablation therapy. Okay. For high-grade dysplasia, there is no doubt. If there is no focal lesion, you directly go to ablation therapy. If there is a focal lesion, you treat the focal lesion. And then for rest of the mucosa, you go for the ablation therapy. If there is adenocarcinoma, if it is superficial, you may attempt endoscopic removal. Otherwise, the patient may have to go for surgery. So what we realize from this slide is that so much depends on your detection of dysplasia. Now think about the 4-quadrant biopsy which we do. When you do just 4-quadrant biopsy, it's a random biopsy. You may not pick up all the dysplastic area. So there is a miss rate. So how can we improve the detection of dysplasia? Because that's what determines what therapy we are offering to the patient. Then if somebody has a focal lesion, what are the endoscopic therapies available for that person? And what are the options of ablation therapies? I'll be discussing briefly about this in the next few slides. So in terms of improving detection of dysplasia, a lot of studies have been published on use of image-enhanced endoscopy, okay, including narrowband imaging, etc. And meta-analysis has shown that they detect 30% more dysplastic lesions than a normal white light. Other technology called acetic acid application, this again has been shown to pick up more dysplastic lesions. Then you have newer technologies like VLE or volumetric laser endomicroscopy or confocal laser endomicroscopy. So among this, now quite a few centers in our country have NBI. This is something which I use in my practice as well. So a few slides on NBI. So when you do narrowband imaging, if you look at the pattern of Barrett's, the pattern can be ridge type, it can be villous, it can be any type. So by looking at the pattern alone, you cannot be sure if it is Barrett's. You need to take biopsy. Okay. The main benefit of NBI or image enhancement lies in the fact is that it picks up more dysplastic lesion and it picks up higher grades of dysplasia. So for Barrett's, there is a very simple classification proposed by Dr. Pradeep Sharma and group. And they have just said that you look at the surface pattern or the mucosal pattern and you look at the vascular pattern. If there is any irregularity in any of them, then the lesion, then there's 85% chance that the lesion you're dealing with is dysplastic lesion. Okay, so very simple to remember. So I'll just show you a couple of examples. This is one of our patients with Barrett's. Now in this area, this is the white light where you can't make out the details. But when you do NBI, you can see the surface in the vascular pattern, which is quite regular. So there's no dysplasia in this particular case. But if you look at this example, there's another patient of our patient with Barrett's. So here on white light, everything looks similar. But on NBI, if you see, some areas, the vascular pattern looks abnormal compared to the rest. So if you had NBI, then you will definitely target and take biopsy from here, because a random biopsy may or may not target this. You may take random biopsy from here and here if you had only white light endoscopy. So it helps us in targeting biopsy. But please remember that as of now, we still cannot get away with 4-quadrant biopsy. So even though NBI is good, it helps you in taking targeted biopsy, you still have to take the 4-quadrant biopsy and then do targeted biopsy for abnormal area on NBI or any other image enhancement endoscopy. So that was about improving the detection of dysplasia. So as I said, image enhancement, something available in many centers we can use. The acetic acid technology, again, I'm not discussing because of lack of time. In terms of endoscopic removal of lesion, so the lesion can be removed by EMR, which is endoscopic mucosal resection. You have the band ligation or the cap technique. The cap technique is shown here, where you have the snare at the end of the cap. The lesion is sucked in, then you close the snare and you resect the lesion. Or you can do an EST. EST is technically more demanding, but it gives you an en bloc resection. Now, these procedures of EMR, EST, there may be complications like strictures, bleeding, etc. So we have to be aware of that. After you have resected the lesion, you have to look at the histology report. If there is cancer in the report, then these features should be there to say that you have done a curative resection. There should be good differentiation. The margin should be free of tumor. There should not be deep submucosal involvement, and there should not be lymphovascular involvement. If any of the things is not there and present, then the patient has to go for surgical therapy. Okay. And finally, as I said, endoscopic ablation therapy is required for all patients with high-grade dysplasia. So if you have high-grade dysplasia, if the focal lesion you treat endoscopically, after focal lesion is treated, you go for ablation. If there is no focal lesion, you directly go for ablation therapy. Okay. And this ablation therapy, obviously, there are different technologies, of which we have the radiofrequency ablation, the cryotherapy, and the APC. The most popular one is the radiofrequency ablation. Patients may require up to 3 to 4 sessions. Okay. The endpoint of therapy for this is basically the patient should have complete remission of intestinal metaplasia, what is called as CRIM. Okay, so that should be the endpoint of therapy with radiofrequency or any ablation therapy. Now, please remember that even after you have done the ablation therapy, there is still a risk of recurrence. And therefore, doing ablation therapy doesn't mean the patient should not be on surveillance. Patient still has to be on surveillance after ablation therapy. The current recommendation is that you should do surveillance at 3, 6, 12 months and then annually. So I want to conclude the section on Barrett's by these few statements by our Indian Society of Gastroenterology. So ISG has made guidelines on GERD, and few of the recommendations are for Barrett's among those guidelines actually. So for diagnosis of Barrett's, you just need columnar metaplasia. You don't need intestinal metaplasia as in the US. The presence of columnar metaplasia is sufficient to diagnose Barrett's. It should be at least 1 centimeter, more than 1 centimeter. Unlike in Japan, where even a smaller segment is considered to be Barrett's, we need more than 1 centimeter of distance between the G junction and the squamocolumnar junction. And finally, they also say that there is no study from India to support routine surveillance in patients with no dysplasia. Now, this doesn't mean that we should not do surveillance. Basically, there's no evidence, doesn't mean that surveillance is not beneficial. What they're saying is that right now we don't have data from India, but I think we have to make individual decision about our patients which we see. So that was about Barrett's. Now a little bit about gastric intestinal metaplasia. So that we discussed about intestinal metaplasia in the esophagus. Now this intestinal metaplasia can also be seen in the stomach. Okay. So again, as the name suggests, the gastric epithelium is replaced by intestinal epithelium. If the intestinal epithelium resembles small intestinal epithelium, then it is called complete metaplasia. Now, this is characterized by the brush border cells, the mature goblet cells. You see the brush border here, the mature goblet cells. If the intestinal metaplasia resembles, if the epithelium resembles colonic epithelium, then it is called incomplete metaplasia. So if it is a small intestinal epithelium, it is called complete metaplasia. Colonic epithelium, it is called incomplete metaplasia. So they are divided into type 1, 2, and 3. Type 1 is same as complete metaplasia, where the epithelium resembles small intestine and the columnar cells do not have mucin. But in type 2 and type 3, which are colonic, there the columnar cells contain mucin. In type 2, the columnar cells have sialomucin. In type 3, the columnar cells have sulfomucin. Now, these mucin require special stain like Alcian blue or iron diamine, which is not available freely. And so it's not done in most of the centers, actually, including even we don't do it in our center as well. But the importance of this lies in the fact is that somebody with type 2 and 3, the risk of progression to cancer is more compared to type 1. Now, it's not only important to know about metaplasia, it's also important to know how extensive is the metaplasia. If it is only confined to the antrum up to the incisura, it is called limited. If it extends to the body of stomach, then it is called extensive metaplasia. Again, extensive metaplasia has a higher risk of progression to gastric cancer. So in terms of epidemiology, we don't have much data from our country. There was a recent review published in Gastroenterology, which has looked at prevalence in different parts of the world. And they have estimated that in South Asia, it may be around 10%, but this was a low certainty data. During endoscopy, we may come across metaplasia in 5 to 20% of cases. Among the intestinal metaplasia in stomach, about 25% may be extensive where the body is involved. The remaining 75% will be limited to antrum. 30 to 40% may be incomplete. The remaining will be complete metaplasia. The risk factor, the most important risk factor obviously is H. pylori infection, especially the CAG positive strain. Then there are other risk factors as well, like increasing age, smoking, family history of gastric cancer, etc. So this is the pathway of intestinal metaplasia, a normal gastric mucosa with H. pylori infection. Gastritis sets in, which can progress to atrophy, and then it can progress to intestinal metaplasia. Up to here, you see the arrow is bidirectional, so it can reverse back. Beyond this, some patients may progress to dysplasia and cancer, same as in Barrett's. That's where lies the clinical importance of intestinal metaplasia in stomach, that some patients may progress to dysplasia or cancer. So all the intestinal metaplasia is not same, okay? The risk of gastric cancer depends on other features as well. So if somebody is Asian, the risk is higher. In incomplete metaplasia, the risk is more than it is in complete metaplasia. If somebody has extensive metaplasia, then the risk is more than somebody who has just got limited metaplasia in the antrum. So if you have a person of Asian descent who's got incomplete metaplasia and extensive metaplasia, the risk of cancer is highest in that particular individual. In terms of clinical features, again, these are incidental findings. You don't have any specific symptoms of metaplasia. Often patients have symptoms of dyspepsia. The 5-year risk of progression to high-grade dysplasia or gastric cancer is around 2 to 3%. However, in some patients, the lesion are known to regress as well. Okay. So that was about the risk factor and pathogenesis. In terms of diagnosis, obviously diagnosis requires endoscopy and biopsy. And white light endoscopy is not very good. It's not very sensitive in detecting metaplasia. Sometimes you may see this whitish elevated plaques, but they are not very commonly seen. The technology which helps you in picking up a lot of dysplasia is image enhanced endoscopy. And a lot of work has been done on narrowband imaging. There are multiple features which have been described, but the two most important features, one of them is a change of the pit pattern from round to groove or tubulovillous type and presence of light blue crest. So if you look at this picture, it will be clear as what I just now said. So normally in stomach, the white structures or the surface pattern is round, but in metaplasia, it becomes elongated or tubular. Okay, so there's a tubular. And also you can see this whitish lines, light blue line here, line here, line here. So this is called the light blue crest. So if you see these two findings together, you are pretty much certain that you're dealing with a metaplasia. And you can see how NBI helps you to, so you know this area has got metaplasia, whereas this area does not have metaplasia, okay? And we had done a study in our center as well about 10 years ago. We looked at the role of NBI in picking up these metaplastic lesions in a randomized prospective fashion. And we found that NBI picks up much more lesion than a white light endoscopy does. Okay. Now, obviously, the diagnosis has to be confirmed with biopsy. Endoscopy alone is not sufficient. So the question is, are we just going to take biopsy from one area? Well, if you take only biopsy from one area, you will not know the extent of lesion. So if your aim is to manage metaplasia properly, then you need proper mapping biopsy. So the biopsy, according to Sydney protocol, is what is recommended. So you should take 5 biopsies at least, 2 from the antrum, the lesser curve and greater curve, 1 from the incisura, again 2 from the body, 1 from the lesser curve and 1 from the greater curve. So you should take at least 5 biopsies, then only you can map and classify whether it's extensive metaplasia or limited metaplasia. And then the biopsy has to be reported according to the Allgame assessment criteria. To tell you the truth, again, at our center also, we don't do 5 biopsy because we are not sure as to how to do surveillance for this patient. So because there's no definite management plan, but in case if you're going to manage a patient for metaplasia, keep him on surveillance, then you need 5 biopsies. You need to have a pathology reporting according to the Allgame staging. The Allgame takes into account the extent as well as the severity. And somebody with stage 3 and 4 has a higher risk of progression to cancer. So finally, the last part of my presentation, how do we manage and is there any role of surveillance in gastric intestinal metaplasia? So in terms of management, again, if somebody has H. pylori infection, you treat the H. pylori infection. But what about surveillance? So I put a question mark. As of now, we are not sure whether surveillance really helps. So there's no clear-cut recommendation for surveillance actually. But why does the question of surveillance arise? Now, there are a lot of data. This is one of the large studies from Sweden, which is a population-based cohort study. It's a registry-based data of more than 4 lakh patients with precancerous lesion in the stomach as well as normal stomach. Now, these patients with normal or gastritis, atrophy, metaplasia, dysplasia, they had follow-up data of up to 30 years. And as time progressed, what you can clearly see is that people with atrophy, with metaplasia and dysplasia have a much higher risk of cancer compared to rest. So definitely there is an increased risk of cancer in this group, and surveillance may be beneficial. What about doing surveillance per se? This is a very interesting study which was published in Gut in 2002 from UK. In this study, they had taken 166 patients who had pre-neoplastic lesion in stomach. And these patients underwent annual endoscopy for up to 10 years. And they compared them with another group which was left in the community with the physician and general practitioner. And endoscopy was done as per their own requirement, but not annually. So the group which had annual gastric cancer during follow-up. Among these 14 patients, about 65 to 66% were stage 1 or 2. Whereas among the open access group, less than 25% were stage 1 and 2. So they were picking up many more early stage cancer. And therefore, it is not surprising that if you look at the survival, cumulative survival, the surveillance group survival was much better compared to open access. But this was a retrospective study, a smaller study. More recently, a much larger study, a multi-center study from Norway and Netherlands has been again published in Gut. This again included different types of gastric pre-neoplastic lesions and normal mucosa as well. But out of the 279 patients, 183 had intestinal metaplasia at baseline. These patients were followed up for an average of about 5 years, and they had an average of about 3 endoscopy per subject. So during follow-up among these 183 patients, 162 continued to have metaplasia. In 5, it regressed to atrophy. There was no metaplasia on follow-up. But in 16 patients, it progressed to low-grade dysplasia. Now, I feel that 5 years is actually not a very long time follow-up. So now obviously people are getting into low-grade dysplasia. So if these patients are followed up longer, then you're likely to pick up patients with cancer. However, as I said, the data is still not there to recommend uniform screening. So I want to conclude by this guideline, which is recommended by the British Society of Gastroenterology, that if somebody has intestinal metaplasia, you treat the H. pylori infection if it is present. Then all those patients should be subjected to image-enhanced endoscopy. One of them is narrowband imaging. You take biopsy according to Sydney protocol, but you can also take targeted biopsies based on the image-enhanced endoscopy finding. If the patient has extensive metaplasia, that is the metaplasia extends to body, or if the patient has metaplasia along with family history of gastric cancer, then these patients should be kept on a 3-yearly endoscopic surveillance with image-enhanced endoscopy. This is again like an expert opinion. But as I said, until more data comes, we can't recommend uniform screening, but we can use it for individual patient based on the risk factors. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you. So you're muted, sir.
What's the plan, Dr. Mohan Prasad? Do we allow the questions now or only
no,
after?
I think we'll go to the lecture.
I think I would only make one comment that, as usual, Amit has made a very difficult topic very simple. Some of the slides for the PGs is worth looking at, particularly the slide on where it showed us the landmarks when you describe and how you describe the endoscopy and histology. I think that one slide is worth the whole spending one and a half hours. I think that slide was fantastic. And as usual, Amit was not only gave us an overview, but he made it look so simple that for me, there was a lot of learning points in this. So since the questions will be later on, let me invite Govind. Dr. Govind Makharia needs no introduction to anybody in the region. I can't talk about India, it's Asia and beyond. So he is an excellent teacher, a great researcher, and a very good organizer. With that, let me invite Govind, who is presently the Secretary General of Indian Society of Gastroenterology, the prestigious Association of Gastroenterology Professionals of India. So Govind, it's yours. All it's yours.
Thank you so much, sir. You have been my teacher,
and we regard you so very much.
Can I interrupt Govindji here? I just would like to welcome Setu Babu, who's the engine. I'm only the